All right, evolution versus creation. Is this really a case? I mean, just the title itself makes you think that this is perhaps a case of science versus religion. A lot of people, when they present the topic or discuss it, they automatically think this is automatically science versus religion. And my basic question is that really true? Is evolution automatically scientific, and is creation automatically religious, and they simply don't talk to each other? There are two different paths to truth, perhaps, and does that actually make any sense? I'd like to start out with some quotes. Here at La Sierra, at least in the upper division science courses, I have some syllabus material, and it's very interesting what's being taught here in La Sierra, at least from my perspective, having grown up in it, going through Adventist schools. I've been interested in this particular topic since grade school myself, and I've never really had a syllabus like this in my personal experience in my Adventist education. So let's just consider what the syllabus has to say. Intro into the syllabus. It is vitally important for you, the students, to realize that this course, as a science course, is describing evidence from mainstream science and is not dealing with beliefs. Some will decide that they cannot believe the scientific evidence. If you expect to become competitive, however, in any modern scientific-based profession and hope to perform well on standardized or pre-professional qualifying exams, you simply must know what the scientific evidence is. Whether or not you believe it, that's a different matter. Just a few questions. Is it true that science doesn't deal with beliefs? Come on. That scientists don't believe anything based on scientific methodologies? That science has nothing to do with determining what is and is not true? Come on. Science is supposed to be a method to sort out truth from error, right? Regarding the physical world. And when you sort out truth from error, you come to your position on certain truths, and you believe those truths to be true, right? So I kind of have a problem with that science doesn't deal with beliefs. Also, isn't there a difference between presenting something for informational purposes and presenting something as actually true, without any challenging arguments, guidance, or even questioning of the presented material? And is there really no science behind SDA views of origins? If not, why are we here? Versus, say, at UCR, down the street. Even in our science classes. Why do you come here? Why do your parents pay a lot of money to send you here if there really is no science behind your religious views? Another quote from the syllabus. Overwhelming evidence. Evolution is supported by an overwhelming and constantly growing amount of scientific evidence. New discoveries continue to fill the gaps identified by Darwin and the origin of species. The evidence is the form of direct, measurable, empirical observation. Is it informed to dismiss Darwin's ideas as just a theory? In science, the word theory means something that accounts for many observations and explains and integrates a great variety of phenomena. The colloquial use of the word theory comes close to what scientists mean when they use the term hypothesis. Continuing with the quote from the syllabus, there is nothing theoretical about the evidence supporting evolution. The research about evolution is ongoing and continues to support and refine Darwin's original ideas. No data have been found to refute this idea. It is the single unifying explanation of the living world, and nothing makes much, if any, sense outside of this unifying theory. The reason this unifying theory has become so widely accepted in the scientific world is that it has stood up to the intense, thorough, continued observation and criticism of the scientific community. The way to become rich and famous in science would be to show a fundamental error in the theory. Man, and I'm still poor. Built-in skepticism of science prevents these ideas from becoming dogma. Okay, is that really true? Built-in skepticism. More questions. If nothing challenges the theory of evolution, where is the built-in skepticism? Would evidence that significantly undermines a key pillar of Darwinian thinking really be received with open arms by mainstream scientists? Now, I know a lot of scientists like to say that they would receive any solid evidence as true, but I have my doubts. I think scientists are just as human as the rest of us and have their own passions, and this is a bit more of a passionate, personal issue than a lot would admit. Are science and religion separate enterprises? Is science based on facts while religion is based on faith, or some people would call it blind faith? What good is blind faith if that's your position? Why do you believe in your religious ideas if you have any? Do you believe in a Santa Claus type God, for example, or what Richard Dawkins famously goes around calling the flying spaghetti monster? How do you know that your God exists and the flying spaghetti monster doesn't exist? And that's a pretty good question, as I would consider it. Can blind faith give any solid hope in the future? If you believe in God, why do you believe in God? What's your evidence that gives you solid hope, that you can really be comforted in? Is there any direct, knowable information that is not based on physical, testable, potentially falsifiable evidence? For example, some people might say that love or beauty, or personally I like vanilla ice cream, all those things are truths that you don't need science for, right? You just know it internally. Can anybody argue with me and say, you don't really like vanilla ice cream? No, I mean, I can just say, I know I've tasted it, I like it. No one can argue with me, right? It needs no further testing, no verification, no committee, no union of my peers on this. I just know it. The same thing with love. Can anybody argue with me if I say, I love my wife Sigrid? No, I know it myself. No one don't need to test it any further. However, let's say I think that Sigrid loves me. My wife loves me. Do I know that with absolute certainty? Direct knowledge, like I know that I like vanilla ice cream? No, right? There's some evidence there. Let's say I came home one day and she hit me on the head with a frying pan and said, "You're the worst husband ever, get out." Might I begin to question my love hypothesis? Right? She continued to do that over and over again for months. I might become more and more concerned about my love hypothesis, right? About if she loved me or not. The same thing is true with God. Let's say you don't see any good evidence for God, and the evidence you do see means that He's not a very friendly God, or He doesn't seem to like you very much. He keeps hitting you on the head with frying pans, per se. Would you begin to doubt your love hypothesis for God, that God really loves you? If that was your experience? I dare say you would. So, is it possible that religion, at least when religion talks about external realities, like somebody else, like God existing in the physical world outside of your mind, and actually loving you, don't you think that religion like that, that talks about external physical realities, should have, or at least could have, some sort of scientific basis? What is science? I propose the answer is yes. So let's look at science in a little bit more direct manner. There are different views of science, but generally most people agree that science is not absolute. Nothing in science discovers any particular truth that you can be absolutely sure of. There are only degrees of certainty that science establishes without ever reaching perfection. And so when you discover a truth outside of your own mind, besides you're liking vanilla ice cream or something, you have to take it with a little bit of grain of salt. In other words, you have to make a tiny little bit of a leap of faith, because if you actually could know something absolutely true, you wouldn't need science. Science is all about predictive value, and if you know something with absolute certainty, science becomes worthless. The scientific method or methodologies become worthless. So what is the scientific method? The basic scientific method, most would agree, even though there are different methods. This is a basic one, and most agree with this one, is that you observe something happen, an observation, a phenomenon. Then you make a prediction, you've come up with an explanation for this phenomenon that predicts how this thing will act in the future. And then you observe it over time, and you see if your prediction held true. If your prediction did hold true, your hypothesis gains predictive value, right? In other words, it's more likely to be correct again in the future. However, if your hypothesis is wrong, you need to revise it or discard it in favor of a different one. That's the basic scientific method. The power of the scientific method is not that it identifies truth. What it does is it identifies error. It identifies where you're wrong, and then you can move away from error and hopefully closer to truth in that process. So truth is never fully realized, short of perfect knowledge, and perfect predictability, as I explained earlier, negates the usefulness of scientific investigation. And also, many consider falsifiability to be a key part of any useful or true scientific hypothesis. And this concept came from Karl Popper. He was a famous philosopher and very influential in the 20th century. He writes, "Any hypothesis that does not make falsifiable predictions is simply not science. Such a hypothesis may be useful or valuable, but it cannot be said to be science." And the reason why he came up with this is because he went to some lectures by Freud, and he noticed that anytime something kind of countered Freud's hypothesis, like, well, you're the way you are because your mother dropped you on your head when you were 2. And so, well, that may be true, but my mother never dropped me on my head. I'm just naturally crazy. And then he would say, then Freud would come up with a different hypothesis. Well, maybe you weren't dropped on your head, but maybe she called you names and, something else. And so it was kind of this very malleable hypothesis. And then he went to listen to lectures by Einstein. And Einstein made very risky predictions that were very definitive and clear-cut, that if evidence was brought against him to show you're wrong on that, his position or hypothesis or theory would be absolutely wrong. No point sidestepping it, he would just be wrong. And so Einstein's theories were much more risky, and Popper thought that was much more scientific because it was potentially falsifiable, whereas some other types of supposedly scientific theories were not really that falsifiable, and he didn't think they were very scientific because of that. So let me give an example. Let's say I go to Las Vegas, and I happen to roll double sixes on the roulette table, or not the roulette, but the craps table, while scratching my nose and standing on one leg. All right? So I roll double sixes, scratching my nose. So then I think to myself, maybe standing on one leg and scratching my nose had something to do with me rolling double sixes. Is that a valid scientific hypothesis? Is it falsifiable? Okay, let's say I take the double and I roll the thing and it happens again. Let's say it happens 100 times in a row every time I scratch my nose and stand on one leg. What do you think about my hypothesis? Does it have predictive value? Does it gain pretty good prediction? Maybe somebody is watching me with a camera and they see me scratch my nose and stand. There could be all kinds of weird hypotheses, but it happens every time I scratch my nose and stand on one leg, I roll double sixes, right? Isn't that a valid scientific hypothesis? It seems to me like it is. And so what happens though if I roll sevens when I do it? What happens to my hypothesis? Is it clearly wrong as it stands? Yeah, it's been absolutely falsified, and it has to be revised or discarded, right? So you can have mundane scientific hypotheses that discuss just about anything. In fact, children, without consciously thinking about it, actually use scientific hypotheses in order to investigate the world around them and learn how to live in it. Even animals do it to a certain degree. So, is the SDA view, could it be scientific? Does the SDA position on origin make any testable, potentially falsifiable predictions concerning the physical world in which we live? If so, has the SDA position been falsified? And that's the key question. So let's look at the SDA position. In 2004, the General Conference got together. There was this big meeting in Utah, and they decided to make it the fundamental belief number 6 a little bit more clearly stated. And this is how they clarified it. They made a few very definitive comments about the SDA fundamental belief on origin number 6. They write, "We affirm the historic Seventh-day Adventist understanding of Genesis 1, that life on earth was created in 6 literal days and is of recent origin. We affirm the biblical account of the fall resulting in death and evil. We affirm the biblical account of a catastrophic flood, an act of God's judgment that affected the whole planet, as an important key to understanding Earth history. In order to address what some interpret as a lack of clarity in fundamental belief number 6, the historic Seventh-day Adventist understanding of the Genesis narrative, be affirmed more explicitly. In other words, church leaders at all levels should be encouraged to assess and monitor the effectiveness with which denominational systems and programs succeed in preparing young people, including those attending non-Adventist schools, and presumably Adventist schools, with a biblical understanding of origins and an awareness of the challenges that they may face in respect to this understanding. So, would you say that that statement has any particular falsifiable features in regard to physical reality? I would propose to you that it does. A worldwide Noachian flood should have physical evidence. A recent six-day creation week should also be supported by physical evidence. If it is not, if you cannot find any physical evidence for that is falsifiable in nature, I propose to you that your religion is no better than believing in a flying spaghetti monster. Testability. Is the stated fundamentalistic position testable in a falsifiable manner? I think so. If evidence is found that life has existed on this planet for hundreds of millions of years, or that it could not possibly have been produced in all its variety in 6 literal days, or that a worldwide Noachian catastrophe is inconsistent with the available data, wouldn't that clearly falsify SDA theology? I think so. It would clearly falsify it. It would make it absolutely wrong in a fundamental way. Therefore, isn't the SDA position at least potentially scientific, at least to a certain degree? I would say yes. The only question then is, has the fundamental stated position of the SDA Church been falsified in regard to origins? Popular scientists obviously think so. They think the SDA position has been falsified. For most scientists, the evidence against fundamental SDA thinking on origins is overwhelming. The SDA position on origins has indeed been very clearly and definitively falsified. What of course this means is that at least the position used to qualify as a valid scientific hypothesis, which is better than nothing, I would propose to you. Having a position that is at least potentially scientific, which has been falsified, is better than having a flying spaghetti monster position that never was falsifiable, even in theory, to begin with. Okay? So what about mainstream theologians? Mainstream theologians, from the Anglican Church to the Catholic Church to a bunch of other churches, to even our own theologians, very popular ones, think that the stated SDA position on origins has also been falsified from a theological perspective. Recently, in 2008, September, because Darwin's birthday and the 150th anniversary of Origin of the Species has come on up a few days ago, Reverend Malcolm Brown, he writes, "The Church of England owes you, Darwin, an apology for misunderstanding you and by getting our first reaction wrong, encouraging others to misunderstand you still. There is nothing here that contradicts Christian teaching. The Church's reaction now seems misjudged." Okay, Vatican response. Not to be outdone, the Vatican response, Darwin's theories are compatible with the Bible and never were condemned by the Catholic Church, nor was his book ever banned. And that's pretty good for the Catholic Church, right? If your book's not banned by the Catholic Church, you're good to go. I would propose to you, though, if the Catholic Church is on your side, you better be a little careful, especially in science. Dr. Desmond Ford, he's a famous theologian from Adventist circles. He writes, "Most educated people in Western countries regard Adventism as 19th century cult. Why? Because of promoting of Ussher's 6,000-year-old Earth for most of our existence, and because we ignored the evidence furnished by these geologic column, astronomy, continental drift, plate tectonics, radiometric and radiocarbon dating, and amino acid dating, etc. Among biblical scholars who do accept the Scriptures as God's supernaturally inspired word, we are also considered as an anachronism because of the way we interpret the early chapters of Genesis. Please note well that the issue here at stake is not the inspiration of Genesis, but its interpretation." I mean, Desmond Ford fully well believes that Genesis is inspired by God. Of course, he bases his inspiration on numerology, on numerical patterns found within the chapters of Genesis, which I think is very interesting because numerology is almost like astrology as far as I can tell. He goes on to write, fundamentalists hold that the literal meaning of the words is to be cherished and taught. There are practically no theologians of worldwide repute in this category. Another group looks at Genesis 1 as literature, semi-poetic in style, using the language of appearance so as to cater to all people of all ages and all places despite illiteracy. The vast majority of scholarly commentaries in the last century take this position. Now, is that true? He's basically arguing that everybody thinks that Genesis 1 was written as kind of this poetic narrative. It wasn't ever intended to be taken literally as any sort of scientific statement about the physical world. So let me propose to you some other views on the author's intent. Is the author's intent important? When they're writing something in the Bible, I propose to you that it is. And James Barr, professor of Hebrew at the University of Oxford, writes in response to this, probably so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or of Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writers of Genesis 1 through 11 intended to convey to their readers the ideas that A, creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. B, the figures contained in the Genesis genealogies provided by simple addition of chronology from the beginning of the world up to the later stages of biblical story. C, Noah's flood was understood to be worldwide and distinguish all human and animal life except for those on the ark. Or, to put it negatively, the apologetic arguments which suppose that the days of creation be long eras of time, the figures of years not to be chronological, and the flood to be a merely local Mesopotamian flood, are not taken seriously by any such professors as far as I know. Now, Professor Barr, he believes in evolution. He believes the Genesis account is mistaken. However, he believes that the authors intended it for it to be taken literally. He just doesn't believe it's true, which is a big difference than believing the authors intended it to be taken allegorically. See the difference? Saying that somebody is wrong is a big difference than saying they were right, but they worded it in a different way. Question. If both mainstream scientists and theologians, arguably the best and brightest minds in the world today, think SDA notions on the issue of origins are wrong, and even the biblical writers themselves didn't understand what they were talking about when they attended, why then should you or me attend SDA schools much like take the title of Seventh-day Adventists? Are we all just plain nuts here? Who wants to be going against the best and the brightest in the entire world living today? And what's the big deal anyway? Why is it even important or an issue at all in the SDA church? Here's at least one perspective on why it might be important, and I happen to agree with him. This is William Praveen, late professor of biological sciences at Cornell. He writes, naturalistic evolution has clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly, which a lot of other people don't seem to. He writes, no gods worth having exist. No life after death exists. No ultimate foundation for ethics exists. No ultimate meaning in life exists, and human free will is non-existent. He goes on to comment regarding the argument that religion is compatible with science. In other words, religion is compatible with modern evolutionary biology and indeed all of modern science if the religion is effectively indistinguishable from atheism. And he's correct. If your religion is all about believing in a flying spaghetti monster, how is that any more benefit to you than being an atheist? Really, I mean, what kind of God do you believe in? Richard Dawkins, famous professor, promoter of science education from Oxford, very well funded. He writes, although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So what does that imply? By implication, if Darwin fails, what happens to intellectual atheism? It fails along with it, right? Is that important? If you really want to be an atheist, you have some sort of deep-seated dislike for God or for moral implications in your life, Would you really struggle against any evidence against atheism? I propose that you would, even if it's illogical. But why would anyone want to be an atheist? Isn't it more hopeful, or don't you find more fulfillment, perhaps, in believing in a kind, loving God? Well, not necessarily. Here's a little clip from Richard Dawkins, and perhaps understand his perspective a little bit more.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
Not a very friendly view of God, right? If you had that view of God, and he grew up in a Christian situation, and he probably, I think he did actually have Christian beliefs that which he became disenchanted with. And I'm rather sympathetic with Dawkins, actually. I think if I grew up with that perspective on God, I wouldn't want to believe in him either. If he was this capricious, malevolent, hateful, murderous bully, who would want to believe in God, right? And from Dawkins' perspective, I think he's one of the most logical people that I've ever come across. He also writes, "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims to believe, not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that." So, am I ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked? Perhaps. So let's look at some other people in my same boat. Here's Richard Smalley. He's winner of the 1996 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. He writes, "Evolution has just been dealt its death blow. After reading Origins of Life by Raza and Ross, with my background in chemistry and physics, it is clear that evolution could not have occurred." Is he just plain nuts? Nobel Prize in Chemistry? Does he not understand Darwinian evolution? Here's Behe. He's a professor of biochemistry. He's a Catholic. He had no problem with evolutionary theory starting out with. He grew up with it, accepted it, went along with it, until he kind of came to this conclusion that it just didn't seem to make scientific sense to him. He writes, "Molecular evolution is not based on scientific authority. There is no publication in scientific literature, in prestigious journals, specialty journals, or books that describe how molecular evolution of any real complex biochemical system either did occur or even it might have occurred. There are assertions that such evolution occurred, but absolutely none are supported by pertinent experiments or calculations." Now I know that some of you are thinking, aha, at the Deauville trial, Behe got just walked over by Johnson and some of the other guys regarding this statement. And I propose to you that he did not. He's not a very good debater on his feet, but let's just go into that a little bit later. Some other guys, Frederick Hoyle and Rick Ramsing, a mathematician, and Frederick Hoyle came up with the term Big Bang Theory. And he used it as a derogatory term. He didn't actually believe in the Big Bang Theory, so he came up with the term Big Bang Theory as kind of a slang or a derogatory term to discredit the theory. But he's the one, it stuck. So that's, he's an astronomer, and he came up with that little phrase. They wrote a book together, Evolution from Space, and they write, "No matter how large the environment one considers, life cannot have had a random beginning. From the beginning of this book, we have emphasized the enormous information content of even the simplest living systems. The information cannot, in our view, be generated by what are often called natural processes, as for instance through meteorological or chemical processes. The information was also needed. We have argued that the requisite information came from an intelligence." Rick Ramsing, in particular, goes on to describe his own educational background. He writes, "It is quite a shock. From my earliest training as a scientist, I was very strongly brainwashed to believe that science cannot be consistent with any kind of deliberate creation. That notion has had to be very painfully shed. I am quite uncomfortable in this situation, the state of mind I now find myself in, but there is no logical way out of it." So he wants to believe in evolution, he wants to believe in naturalistic processes, but he's forced by his, what he views as his scientific background and his mathematical training to doubt it, and he's uncomfortable with that situation. He goes on, once we see that the probability of life originating at random is so utterly minuscule as to make it absurd, it becomes sensible to think that the favorable properties of the physics upon which life is based are in every respect deliberate or created. I now find myself driven to this position by logic. There is no other way in which we can understand the precise ordering of the chemicals of life except to invoke the creations on a cosmic scale. We were hoping as scientists that there would be a way around our conclusion, but there isn't. And he has no bone to pick with Darwin. He wants Darwinism or naturalistic process to explain these things, and he can't seem to get his mind around it. So question, if at least a few well-respected scientists in just about every major field of science, to include Nobel laureates, have problems with some fundamental aspect of naturalism or Darwinian evolution, are these theories really that well understood scientifically, or are they based more on religion or philosophy, and they're motivated by these personal desires? Which is it? Science or philosophy? Why is it such a struggle for most mainstream scientists to even consider the idea of a God or godlike intelligence as being clearly responsible for at least some aspects of our universe or biosystem complexity? Is it because of their scientific training, because of their logic, or because of their philosophical motivation? Here's at least one view, at least one reason why somebody would reject religious ideas and accept mainstream scientific views. Richard Lewontin, professor of zoology at Harvard, writes, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism, regardless of the truth, right? It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow the divine foot in the door. Does this sound like science to you, or some sort of private club where you have initiation rites and almost like you're in a secret society, a religious society? Here's a little video clip from Dean Kenyon. He's the author of Biochemical Predestination. He was a leading evolutionary biologist, and in his book, he presented a theory on how protein building blocks could self-assemble themselves to produce complex biosystems without the need for intelligence. And then one day a student asked him in his class, so what's the point of DNA? And he thought about that for 5 years, and finally he decided that maybe there was an intelligent designer out there. And so this is his take on why his colleagues cannot accept the views he's come to accept and recant his own original position in his own book.
Do many of your colleagues support your new position? If not, why not?
Actually, very few have been supportive of my new views on origin of life and the development of the species. I think a rather larger number of my faculty colleagues, however, are willing to allow me to express these new views in class. But the majority, though, are unhappy on both counts, I would say. And as to why they hold this view, I don't think there's a simple answer to this. Some of the possibilities are that the Darwinian way of thinking is such a deeply ingrained habit of thought. It's been prevalent for such a long time, and it has so many implications for the whole of the biological sciences. Another aspect tied to that, of course, is how graduate students are socialized as they go through their program and hear only the Darwinian story of origins. And I think my colleagues in general, those who are opposed to this, are very reluctant to take time to examine this issue, and maybe they realize the large reorientation of thought that would be required if they were to change their views.
That it's a big struggle. If you've grown up with this, you've been taught it through grade school and all your schooling and postgraduate education, and your career has been based on this. It's a huge, time and money has been expended on this. It's a huge sacrifice to change your views. And the same is true in our culture. If you've grown up Adventist and then you've come to a position that Adventism is somehow mistaken, it's a huge shock to your system to change your paradigm and accept a new view. And the same thing is true for mainstream scientists. That's true both ways. Here's, anybody see the movie Expelled with Ben Stein? For what it was trying to accomplish, there's a lot of debate over it, and maybe some of the style points I wouldn't have done that way because they're very antagonistic, perhaps. But given Ben Stein's background, this is a very interesting movie, and you should at least see it and consider it for what it was trying to show.
If you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology, you might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
But you're crazy to say it's God.
Heavy. Yeah. Yes, you can say it's anything you want, men from outer space, Martians, anything you want, but not God. Cannot be God. Right. It's not allowed to be God.
Right.
So does science really have a problem with the concept of an intelligent designer, even a very powerful one? No, what's the real problem with mainstream science and God? It's the moral implication, right? Okay, here's a little video clip.
They are so closed-minded,
Yes.
and it really, I got the feeling from the movie that it's really not about science.
No, it's about them.
It's anti-God. They cannot allow God to be a part of anything.
Right, because if there's a God, then they might be judged. If there's a God who holds you accountable for your actions, you're in a lot of trouble. Now, I'm going to be the first to agree, I'm in a lot of trouble too. But there's a lot, but they cannot admit that there's a possibility of sin or a possibility of morality, and they can't agree on this basic thing. If man is just a speck of dust struck by lightning and then turned into a human being, then he has no moral responsibility. If we're all children of God, we have some moral responsibility because we all have some little piece of God in us.
Yeah.
That scares them to death.
Okay. So who are you running from? Some alien intelligent designer, or for somebody who holds you accountable for something that you don't want to be held accountable for? Right? Where's the real problem here between science and religion, or religious statements about God? God's signature in nature. Falsifiable science or not? If God does exist, he could act in such a way that we could detect him as both deliberate and intelligent. For example, if there's a big, powerful God who created me and whatever, and I can act in a detectable manner, for example, forensic science is all about detecting human activity, right? Intelligence is required to produce, like the pyramids. Who would go to the pyramids, even if you found pyramids on Mars, who would doubt that those pyramids were the result of intelligent design, right? So as long as the intelligent agent is like a human-level agent or type of creative being, that's not a problem. But are you telling me that a all-powerful God cannot even potentially act in the same detectable manner if he so chooses? Is it possible for God to at least act in such a way that we could detect him as intelligent? I propose that if he's more powerful than me, he could act in a way that I could actually recognize him as intelligent. Of course, it is also possible that God could hide behind natural laws where I would not be able to detect him. That's also possible. But so the question really is not, is God detectable or not, but has God acted in a detectable manner? That's really the question here. If the basic notions behind naturalism and evolution are true, detecting God as a deliberate or intelligent agent would be difficult, if not impossible. For example, if disinterested, mindless laws of nature can explain everything with overwhelming predictive value, how can one detect an intelligent agent of any kind, much less God? If you have natural mindless processes that can ultimately explain everything, how do you detect intelligence? How would Richard Dawkins propose that you could detect E.T.? But there are scientists, mainstream scientists out there, who think that it is possible to detect extraterrestrial intelligence as long as you don't call it God. So how do these scientists propose that we might do this? Well, here's Seth Shostak. He's the senior astronomer for the SETI Institute. He writes, perhaps the extraterrestrial intelligences will preface their message with a string of prime numbers, or maybe the first 50 terms of the ever-popular Fibonacci series. Well, there's no doubt that such tags would convey intelligence. Well, that's very interesting to me, because Thaxton and Bradley and Olson, they point out, or they question anyway, why then doesn't the message sequence in DNA, or the DNA molecule, also constitute prima facie evidence for an intelligent source? After all, DNA information is just analogous to a message sequence like the Morse code, or pi, or the Fibonacci series. It is such a message sequence. It carries information, arguably more information or useful information than pi would carry. So what's the answer? Well, Seth Shostak and the other SETI scientists, they say, well, the difference between SETI and intelligent design theory or creationism is that SETI is based on simplicity, not complexity, right? They argue that we're looking for a simple radio signal, not for a complex radio signal, just a simple narrow band whistle coming from outer space that has a certain narrow band spectrum located in a certain area of the universe. And if we find the simple signal, then we'll know that it was intelligently designed. We're not looking for complexity here. So life, the arguments for complexity in life, that's not what we're arguing. That's why we're different than the intelligent design camp. And radio signals are different than DNA, and the information contained in DNA is produced by a known natural mechanism, random mutations and natural selection. Therefore, we know the mechanism for DNA complexity. We don't know any mechanism for the simplicity of a narrowband radio signal. So that's the difference between us and those stupid intelligent design theorists. Okay? Let me ask you, what's so special about simplicity? SETI scientists believe that non-intelligent natural forces in certain types of environments are extremely unlikely to be able to produce certain types of narrowband radio signals. They came to this conclusion after extensive investigation of all known forces of nature. Does that mean they know everything about nature? No, they only know about what they know. They know that given what we know now, right now, there's nothing that we know that produces this type of radio signal, right? What happens in the future if they find a radio signal produced by a natural process? What happens to their theory? Is it falsifiable? Yes. Is it scientific? Yes, it is. It's scientific. It has potentially predictive value, that if you don't find anything as you go along, your hypothesis gains predictive value. That if this type of signal is very artifactual, but it's also falsifiable. If they happen to find something in the future that's produced by a natural, apparently mindless process, it would falsify their theory. So, they've concluded that since no known mindless forces of nature come even close, well, at least humans can produce such signals, that anytime such a signal is found, that it must have been the result of at least some form of human-level intelligence. That is the argument for SETI. And I think it makes great sense. It makes perfect sense to me. So, are there any general applications beyond radio signals? Let me ask you, can we apply it to granite rocks, for example? I made a little quiz for you. Here are a bunch of granite rocks. I don't know if you can see my little red dot. Upper right-hand corner, designed or not? Raise your hand if you think it's designed. Not? Everybody raise your hand if you think it's not designed. Nature produced it? Few hands, some people aren't sure. How about this one? A granite cube, highly symmetrical, polished. Designed? More hands. Not designed? Anybody think not designed? Not one hand? A pretty clever bunch. And some of these may be in between, perhaps, right? But these two are kind of maybe on extremes of the spectrum, perhaps. Well, let me tell you, all of these are designed. These rocks here, they're produced by a company that makes natural rocks for your garden. Okay? So, can humans make stuff that look natural? Yes. Can nature make stuff that looks designed? No. Well, it depends, right? Can nature make a highly symmetrical polished granite cube? Let's say I go to Mars, or let's say a Mars Land Rover is putting along, and it comes up to a meter high, perfectly symmetrical, or at least really highly symmetrical, polished, shiny granite cube sitting on Mars right there on the surface. And let's say it has a little triangle carved in this face, and a square carved in the middle of this face, and a little geometric shape carved in the other face. How many people will not think that would hit the front page of every newspaper in the world? Right? Everybody think that would be obviously designed, even if it was found on Mars? Even the society scientists would be beside themselves with happiness, right? Obviously designed. So, nature has limits, right? Certain limits that if you can investigate something long enough, even in 1 trillion years, would you think nature could do that? Here's some other examples. Crop circles first began appearing in England in the early 1980s or so, right? Some scientists, mainstream scientists, proposed unusual weather patterns for these crop circles when they first started appearing. Would anybody think this crop circle was the result of some fancy tornado? Anybody in 1 trillion years? I mean, given enough time, the unlikely become. Why do we say that? You know, how do we know that? It's because you have to have some prior knowledge with the material in question. For example, here's a highly symmetrical cube, right? Here's pyrite, here's salt, crystal. Did nature produce that? Right? Doesn't that look like the same geometry essentially as the crop circles for the snowflake? Did nature produce that? Mindless nature, natural law? It did, right? But it has the same essential geometry and shape. Why do we believe that this is produced by nature instead of God chiseling each snowflake out very carefully? Why do we believe that nature did that, but we don't believe nature did the whole crop circle thing? Right? It's because, or the whole granite cube thing. It's because we have some experience with the material in question. We know the limits of natural law and natural process after we investigate the material in question extensively. If you just came up to this and you had never experienced crops before, would you have any idea if this could be produced by nature or not? No. You have to have some background. You have to study it. You have to use science. How about this? French garden? You think that all the seeds just fell this way and grew like that naturally? Right? No one would believe that, right? Because you have experience with gardens. You know they take a lot of work to make them look like that. What about all this stuff in the background? Nature or not? How about this? Anybody believe that, was that nature or designed? How many people think designed? Few, a very smart crowd. Planting the natural garden, right? Yeah. So, designed. How about this one? A big hurricane picked up all these trees and shoved them into the beach here in England, right? Is that what happened? Designed or not? Nature did that? Designed, right? Obviously. How about this? Given a few trillion years, this is bound to happen somewhere in multi-universes, right? Stonehenge? Anybody believe that? So what about complexity? Is it not possible that at least some forms of complexity may also be beyond any known force of nature and yet within the realm of at least human-level intelligence and creative powers of production? Remember Shostak's comments about long sequences of pi and Fibonacci series. Are those not forms of a degree of complexity? They are, and by his own arguments they are. He's just confused. When creationists get him on one point, he says, whoa, we're not talking about complexity. But he just did. He just did talk about at least a form of complexity. But what about meaningful or functional informational complexity? That's not the same thing as Shannon informational complexity or randomness, otherwise known as algorithmic complexity, and some call it chaos. We're not talking about random sequences of numbers or chaos. Some people call randomness complex, right? Because we don't understand it, or we can't predict it, so people call that complex. There's other forms of complexity that are very predictable, very understandable. They're called meaningful or informational complexity of a certain type. Not all forms of the word information are used in the same sense. I'm talking about meaningful or functional information here, and the information or the complexity associated with that. For example, a lot of people would say this is a flagellar motility system. It's got a drive shaft, a motor, a rotor, all these things that are comparable to a machine. A lot of people would say this is functionally and informationally complex. And in fact, a lot of people deride the flagellar system, Kenneth Miller in particular, and they call it the poster child for intelligent design movement or creationism. And I would agree, it is the poster child because it's so cool. Anyway, so just a few little movies about this to help you understand why this is the poster child.
One machine particularly attracted his attention.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called the bacterial flagellum with all of its parts in all of its glory. It's had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the motor and so on. I looked at that and I said, that's an outboard motor. That's designed, that's no chance assemblage of parts.
Behe's reaction was not surprising, for the molecular motors that drive bacteria through liquid each depend upon a system of intricately arranged mechanical parts. These parts come into focus when portions of a cell are magnified 50,000 times. Biochemists have used electron micrographs like this one to identify the parts and three-dimensional structure of the flagellar motor. In the process, they have revealed a marvel of engineering on a miniaturized scale.
Howard Berg at Harvard has labeled it the most efficient machine in the universe. These machines, some of them are running at 100,000 RPMs and are hardwired into a signal transduction or sensory mechanism so that it's getting feedback from the environment.
And even though they're spinning that fast, they can stop on a dime. It only takes a quarter turn for them to stop and shift directions and start spinning 100,000 RPM in the other direction.
And just like outboard motors on motorboats, it has a large number of parts which are necessary for the motor to work.
The bacterial flagellum, 2 gears, forward and reverse, water-cooled, proton motive force, it has a stator, it has a rotor, it has a U-joint, it has a drive shaft, it has a propeller, and they function as these parts of machines. It's not convenient that we give them these names. That's truly their function.
So, obviously designed, right? Not so fast. I mean, there's pretty good arguments from the other side, especially presented by famous biologist from Brown University, Kenneth Miller. And this is a portion of his lecture which counters Behe in a pretty convincing manner, I would have to say. So here's this little clip from Kenneth Miller.
The notion that these complicated biochemical structures couldn't have been produced by evolution has been championed by Michael Behe. And Behe has an idea that he calls irreducible complexity. And he says, you can't evolve these things because they're irreducibly complex. Notice what he says. An irreducibly complex system can't be produced the way that evolution works, by numerous successive slight modifications of a precursor system, because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. These are multi-part systems. And he's basically telling you that the 30 or 40 proteins that are in here, they all have to be together or there's no function. And since natural selection does have to work gradually, I agree on that point, it can't produce 20, 25, 26 proteins knowing what will eventually happen because natural selection is blind, which is indeed absolutely true. So the poster child for intelligent design by any standard, it shows up so often, it really could be called the poster child, is in fact the bacterial flagellum. This was mentioned so often in the trial that the judge, probably from fatigue, got a little sarcastic about it. One of the attorneys said, "Your Honor, when we reconvene, we're going to talk again about the bacterial flagellum." And the judge at one point said, "Oh, goody." The last expert witness for the Board of Education, a biochemist named Scott Minnick from the University of Idaho, was called up to the stands to talk about this. And since Behe had talked about it, the lawyers had talked about it, and they had argued about it, and I had talked about it, as I'm going to show you here for a second, Minnick got up there, and he said he was going to talk about the bacterial flagellum. And the judge deadpanned, "Well, we've heard that before." And Minnick turned to him. This is the best line of the trial. Minnick turned to him and said, "You know, Your Honor, I sort of feel like Zsa Zsa Gabor's fifth husband. I know what to do, I just don't know how to make it exciting." So I take my hat off to Scott. That was good. I like that. So what is this argument about? Here's the argument in very simplified form. If you have a complex, multi-part biochemical machine composed of many parts, its function, everyone agrees, can be favored by natural selection. But the argument is that evolution can't produce them because the individual parts have no function of their own. That's what irreducible complexity means. So natural selection can't make this, doesn't have any function. Can't make that, can't make that. Therefore, you can't evolve a structure like this. Now, how does evolution explain something like that? Well, ever since Darwin, we've had a very good explanation. And that is these complicated machines, they don't arise from scratch. They arise from combinations of components that have different functions, functions of their own. And the components originate with functions of their own as well. Therefore, natural selection will work every step of the way. Now, that's not evidence. That's just an argument. But the beauty of this is we can now hold these two ideas up against each other. And we can say, who's right? If irreducible complexity is right, then the parts of these machines should be absolutely useless. But if evolution is right, we should be able to take these machines, look at their parts, and discover, wow, they do other jobs. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's take the bacterial flagellum. So if we start with the flagellum, here it is, and these drawings name the genes and the proteins in the flagellum, and we say, let's take away a whole bunch of the parts. How many? Not 1, not 5, not 10. Let's take 40 of its 50 parts away. Now watch very carefully, because I'm going to do that experiment right there. There it goes. The parts are all gone, and I have left 10 parts that span the membrane. What are left behind are 10 proteins in the base of the flagellum. Now, if irreducible complexity is right, this should be absolutely functionless. It should have no function. But if you'll pardon the double negative, what is left behind is not non-functional. What is left behind is the type 3 secretory system, and it is fully functional. I know most of you in the room are going, of course, the type 3 secretory system. The type 3 secretory system is a molecular syringe in which some of the nastiest bacteria on this planet produce toxic proteins, grab onto one of our cells, and inject those proteins into our cells. The bacterium that causes bubonic plague works this way. It's really nasty stuff. Well, guess what? The 10 proteins that make up the type 3 secretory system are directly homologous to the 10 proteins in the base of the bacterial flagellum. They don't produce movement. They're not a flagellum. But are they functional? They are fully functional. So remember that claim. Any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. This guy is missing 40 parts, and it is perfectly functional. What that means, there's no other word for it, is that that statement is wrong. Now, that's not an incidental statement. That is the heart and soul of the intelligent design argument. And in this case, it turns out to be wrong. Now, it's even wronger than that, because it turns out that not only do these proteins make up the type 3 secretory apparatus, but almost every protein in the bacterial flagellum is strongly homologous to proteins that have other functions elsewhere in the cell. And what that means is when we look at this wonderful icon of intelligent design, a careful analysis of the flagellum actually matches evolutionary theory, namely the parts should have functions of their own and not the intelligent design prediction.